Hi, my name is Mr. Graham, and today we'll be taking a virtual tour of my art gallery, starting with printing. Although printing as an art form became popular in Europe in the 1450s, it actually dates back over 1100 years to hand-printed scrolls made in China. Here you can see an example of one of my prints titled Shark in Hiding. I wanted people to imagine the shark moving silently through the water, but to create this print I began by drawing my picture directly onto a styrofoam sheet with a pen. You need to press firm enough to carve out the design, but not so hard that you go all the way through. Next, I took a clean paint roller and rolled out white paint so that the roller had a thin, smooth covering on it. I then rolled the roller directly onto the carved picture, making sure that the entire sheet had a smooth covering of paint. Next, I carefully placed a black sheet paper on top of the carved image. Then, taking a clean roller, I rolled it back and forward over the black paper, pressing it down against the foam. Finally and carefully, I peeled back the black paper from the foam, and voila, a beautiful print. Let's take a moment to look at a print by the Australian artist Margaret Preston. Margaret Preston was born on the 29th of April 1875 in Port Adelaide and studied art both in Australia and in Europe. Later in her life, Margaret was inspired by Aboriginal art and culture. This artwork, titled Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, was created in 1952, and it depicts an Aboriginal couple surrounded by Australian native birds, animals, plants and trees. And many people who first viewed this artwork were angry because they interpreted it as meaning that the first people on Earth were Indigenous Australians and not white people. We need to remember at this time when it was painted, Indigenous Australians were seen by many people as inferior to white people. In fact, Indigenous Australians at this time were not allowed to vote or even own land. This is a great example of how art can be used to send a powerful message to its viewers. Let's take a look at our next art form, drawing. Archaeologists tell us that humans have been drawing since humankind began, with the earliest known drawings dating back over 30,000 years. In fact, people were drawing pictures long before they learned how to write. Here you can see an example of one of my own artistic works titled Mapping the Shoalhaven, which incorporates a variety of art forms including collage, painting and drawing. To create this artwork, I taped my paper to a large wooden board so that when I later added water and paint, the paper would not curl up. I then used a fine felt tip pen and tried to draw a continuous line in the shape of one side of the Shoalhaven River using a map as my guide and not looking at the paper. I then drew the other side of the river from memory. Using my imagination, I then added a variety of lines including dotted, straight, curved, even thick lines for emphasis in some places. I also experimented with zigzag lines symbolizing bridges. After my collage, stenciling and painting sections were completed, I finished my drawing with a still life picture of a local flower. The picture was then cut out and placed in the center of my artwork for balance. Let's take a moment to look at a drawing by a famous artist called Paul Klee titled The Mocker Mocked. Paul was born in Switzerland in 1879, and he was not interested in drawing or painting images that were lifelike. Instead, he was interested in shapes, color, and creating simplified two-dimensional images. Some people saw his work as free but childlike. I wonder what you think. In this drawing, Klee used a technique called unbroken or continuous line drawing. In this style of art, the drawing instrument never leaves the paper until you're finished. Klee is another example of an artist who was less interested in what other people thought about his art and more interested in expressing himself through his art. Okay, let's take a look at our next art form, which is painting. Here again is my artwork, Mapping the Shoalhaven. Throughout the following steps, I kept my picture flat so the water and paint would not run to other parts of my artwork. I began by taking clean water onto my brush and painting over where I had previously drawn the river. I then took dark blue paint that had been diluted with water and painted it directly over the river. I then used a clean paper towel to carefully blot up the excess water and blue paint. I then used a clean brush to paint diluted green paint on either side of my river to represent land, and I then blotted up the excess paint with a clean towel. Keeping my artwork flat, I then allowed it to dry. By using my blue and green paint this way, I was not trying to paint a lifelike image of the river, but just to give that impression. Let's take a moment to view a painting by an Australian Indigenous artist called Albert Namatjira. Albert was born in 1902 and grew up 120 kilometres west of Alice Springs. Like many Indigenous Australians, Albert had a strong connection to the land that he referred to as Mother Earth. And this not only influenced his artwork, but also his life. In this painting titled Ghost Gum Central Australia, which was painted in 1950, has a majestic gum tree standing like a ghostly figure watching over the landscape. The sad story behind Albert Namatjira's paintings is that whilst by the late 1930s he was considered one of Australia's top artists, because he was Aboriginal, he was still not allowed to own land or even buy a home. Many Australians and other people around the world were outraged by this fact and pressured the Australian government to grant him and his wife full citizenship in 1957. They were the first Indigenous Australians to get full citizenship. Tragically, it would take another 10 years before full citizenship was granted to all Indigenous Australians. Albert Namatjira's artistic talent and fame played an important role in drawing the world's attention to the terrible discrimination of that period against Indigenous Australians. The final art form in my gallery is sculpture. Sculpture may be the oldest of all art forms. Archaeologists and historians believe that people carved images long before they painted or even designed dwellings. Yet unlike many artists today, our ancient ancestors tended to create sculptures that were not designed for beauty or to be appreciated as art forms. Instead, their sculptures were of images based on the afterlife and of the spirit world, and the images were worshipped or feared. It's interesting to note that sculpture is the only branch of the visual arts that always operates in 3 dimensions. The sculpture on display here is my own work, and it's called The Alien Monster. My inspiration for this artwork was based on a challenge from my teacher to create a scary monster using a limited range of household materials. I started by joining 2 wooden curtain rod holders together with a fly swatter in the middle. After gluing them all in place, I then placed the end of the fly swatter into a plastic bottle to symbolize the monster's body. I then glued 2 blue plastic golf balls and 2 googly eyes to bring my sculpture to life. I finished by tying pipe cleaners onto the curtain rod holders as antennas for the monster. Let's take a moment to look at a sculpture by an artist who was born in Turkey in 1951, grew up in South Africa, and then moved to Australia in her mid-20s. This artistic work by Jenny Orchard, called her Ceramic Creature, is an excellent example of an artist expressing themselves through their art. The vibrant colour, along with its unique design, were both influenced by her childhood growing up in South Africa. It was made by moulding the clay into the shape that she wanted. It was then coloured, glazed, and put into a hot oven called a kiln, and that hardened it. Jenny's artwork is yet another great example of the imaginative fun that art can be and the influence that our past can have over our experiences today.